Good day, everybody. Welcome to the annual review, making it more fun than a colonoscopy. It's not a phrase I ever thought I would say publicly, but here we are. I'm David Pollack, Faculty Development Specialist with IDEA. I'm glad you could set aside 30 minutes for this conversation today. At a minimum, I hope that this at least gets you thinking about your annual review process and ways that it can be improved. But perhaps you'll come away with some very concrete, specific thoughts here that you will find useful. We'll have a little bit of time at the end of our session here for discussion and adding more ideas to the discussion, depending on what you have to say and how much time we have left, but we'll do that a little bit later. These ideas are based on best practices in faculty evaluation, as well as our experience at IDEA and working with campuses over the years. So again, I hope you find these things useful. So the idea for the title of this session came from the idea that no one that I know looks forward to a colonoscopy, and not many look forward to that annual review process either. Certainly not usually the faculty being evaluated. And very often, even the people doing the evaluating, the deans and the chairs, are not particularly looking forward to it either. It's an awkward situation, an awkward process. It can be kind of uncomfortable. And unfortunately, unlike a colonoscopy, we don't use anesthesia for these annual reviews. So it winds up being painful. So came up with this title because it kind of fit and because frankly it was attention getting, but in thinking about the actual principles that we want to share, I realized it fits the analogy actually in a number of places. So if you will allow me, I'm going to continue the analogy a little bit as we go on here. Now, most deans and most chairs are given very little, if any, training or guidance, really, even in how to conduct evaluations of faculty. And in fact, it's very similar to what happens with faculty and teaching. As you're well aware, many faculty come into a teaching position without having had any training in how to teach well, and suddenly they're doing it. And so what do? They wind up teaching the way they were taught. I think the same thing happens with deans and chairs doing evaluation very often, is without any kind of guidance or process of thinking about how to do it, what do? They do exactly what was done to them. So if you were reviewed well and evaluated well in your experiences, and that turns out well for you. If you were not, then of course it's not such a good thing. So again, I hope today in our time we can talk about some principles that will help make this process a lot more fun than a colonoscopy, and something that is more that is very productive for all involved. So the first idea I want to share with you is that in an annual review, there should be no surprises. That is, you go into a colonoscopy, to continue the analogy here, not knowing what the outcome will be, right? Things could be just fine, or there could be something really horrible going on. Annual reviews shouldn't be like that at all. They should be discussions about things that were already known. This is not a discovery process. The annual review is not a discovery process where we're discovering things like in a colonoscopy. It is a review process of what is already known. So it's not like in a courtroom drama situation where you're going to surprise somebody with some sort of evidence. I have a really frustrating personal experience with this. One of my first evaluations when I first started teaching, and at this particular school, the student evaluation forms were sent to the dean first. He looked at them and then he distributed them to us. At the end of this particular year, my annual evaluation was set up about the same time. So I had not seen any of the student evaluations yet until I came into that annual evaluation meeting. And I sat down, and one of the things he did in the meeting was hand me a specific student open-ended comment that was pretty critical of the course, didn't like hardly anything that I did. That was the first time that I had seen it, had no time to think about it. I mean, I'm literally sitting there reading it while he's sitting there waiting on me to read this student comment. That's not productive. That's very destructive. Puts faculty on the defensive. It gives them no time to think about and process it and put it in context and think about what to do about it. The annual review is not a time for those kind of surprises. So what you want to do instead is communicate throughout the year and really communicate to faculty that you expect them to keep you posted on issues in progress. For instance, if a class is a particular disastrous class, instead of waiting for you to find out through student feedback or at that annual evaluation, encourage them, tell me how things are going, check in with them throughout the year. If you're able to do it time-wise, set up short meetings regularly throughout the year, at the very least, email check-ins to see how things are going, how your class is going, how's that paper you're working on, that sort of thing throughout the year. So that when the time comes for that annual evaluation, again, it's not a discovery process. It is a review process of what is already known. We're going to come together, kind of summarize what we've been talking about all year long, and finally come to this annual conclusion about how things are going for you. This is not to really drive this analogy into the ground here. It's not dissimilar to the idea from colonoscopies that the worst part of it is not the actual colonoscopy, right? But the prep. And I could attest to that in my own personal experience for sure. It's a similar thing here. The annual review is not so much about that 1 hour or whatever it is that you're sitting together. It's about all of the pieces of data and experiences from the previous year that go into that. So another thing related to this idea about no surprises is to make sure that you and the faculty know your policy that you have on campus. Annual reviews are usually set out in a policy with specific guidelines on what's supposed to be in them and maybe what's not in them. If you don't have a specific policy on your campus, or one that you think is clumsy or unclear or whatever, you might, this is one place you might consider really poking leaders or your TMP committees to rethink the guidelines for that. So the idea connected to surprises here is if you know the policy, you know what's expected, then you know what's going to happen in the annual review, and neither you nor the faculty member is going to be surprised about any of that. So know it yourself and make sure that your faculty know it as well. Another thing that this helps you do is sort of not be the bad guy in the situation. So if your policy says, for example, that X should happen in this year of this faculty member and X doesn't happen, then when it comes time for the review process, you have no permission to, I mean, it's not your idea to write this person up or to write down that they didn't do X. It's part of the policy. You have no choice. So it doesn't reflect like you're being a bad person or a mean person by calling them out on X, but it's part of the policy. So that puts it back on the policy and makes things a little bit more pleasant for the two of you. Another idea here that's important is that annual reviews should not be a one-way evaluation. Now, colonoscopies definitely are, right? Even the patient is even totally asleep during the process and the physician is doing all the evaluation. Well, with an annual review, the idea here is it should be much more of a collaborative process where the reviewer and the reviewed are working together over this known evidence, these things that we've talked about before. And one of them is definitely not asleep. We're both actively involved in this process. Now, this leads to some very specific concrete ideas I'll get to here in just a second, but it also applies to just the general attitude. The general attitude for an annual review is going to be much more productive if this is a collaboration, this is a conversation, this is not me sitting like in a court of law passing judgment over you, but we're having a conversation here together. So one of the ways that translates into something very specific is that you should expect meaningful self-evaluation from faculty. If this is not already built into your policies and procedures, I would encourage you to work toward having that done so that you're expecting faculty to self-evaluate, to interpret what evidence they have about how effective they're being, instead of expecting you to do it for them. So review discussion should be mainly about the instructor examining evidence, presenting their evidence, discussing weaknesses and strengths and what they're going to do to make improvements in the future. This is especially true of teaching, I think. At IDEA, we promote the concept of reflective practice, as shown in this graphic that you see here, which promotes the idea of rather than kind of a knee-jerk reaction to feedback, let's say students don't like some aspect of a course, rather than just dropping everything or dropping perhaps group activities that students say they don't like, is to really dig in and reading and learning about the issue, then reflecting on what all this evidence and the best practices tell us, discussing it with other people, which is something that doesn't happen a lot with faculty, and then working to improve it. So we encourage faculty to do this through IDEA, and I would encourage you to encourage this reflective practice process through your annual review process. In our model of self-evaluation, we encourage faculty to take a deeper look at the things you see on the screen here. So we have sources of feedback from students. Peer feedback can be reviews of the design of a course, syllabi, assessments, assignments, that sort of thing. Other data means things like student outcomes on exams, program outcomes, professional exams, that sort of thing, that give them some evidence of how well students are learning things. And all those things reflect on three areas: our instructional practices, the content of the course and how it's built, as well as the student learning experiences. And then finally, the reflection. So what's happening here, what's working, what's not, what can be improved, and what specifically should I do next? So when you build in this kind of meaningful self-evaluation into your annual evaluation, it's putting the onus on the faculty member to do a lot of introspection, a lot of self-evaluation of what's going on, which is ultimately going to result in more improvement, particularly related to teaching, I think. So I strongly encourage you to build that part into your annual evaluation. Another thing to consider is especially when it comes to teaching, is to consider a variety of evidence. On some campuses, there is an overdependence on one source of evidence, and particularly what I'm thinking of here is teaching effectiveness and an over-reliance on student feedback. You see here our IDEA student ratings of instruction summary report that faculty get from students. We think this is really useful and is very much needed in order for faculty to understand how their instruction is going, and even as a part of faculty evaluation. But it's certainly not everything. So you should always consider other sources of evidence, things like the design of the course, again, assignments and assessments, student performance, perhaps some sort of peer feedback, whether it's observational or review of materials. Always look at multiple sources of evidence and don't over-rely on any one, because any one particular source of evidence about effectiveness can disadvantage a faculty member unfairly. And when you have multiple views about what's going on, particularly thinking about instruction here, when you have multiple views of how well instruction is going, then you get a more accurate view of what's happening. So try to build into your system and your review process multiple sources of evidence. Related to this idea is don't focus too much, especially in this annual review, on outliers. That is one thing that went particularly wrong. Going back to my story of one of my early reviews with my dean, where out of something like 130 student surveys of my teaching, the great majority of which were very positive, very good, he pulled out one outlier of somebody who was really unhappy. And we spent, as I recall this meeting, we spent more time talking about that one student feedback than we did any other single thing in that entire meeting. That's not helpful at all. Outliers usually are just that, an outlier. They're not really indicative of anything. Of course, if it is something that needs attention, students complaining about some inappropriate behavior or something, that's a different matter. But if it's just general student feedback that's an outlier, don't concentrate too much on that. It's going to kill morale. It's going to affect your relationship with that instructor. And I would encourage you to find other ways of dealing with that, which is primarily to ignore it unless it comes up again. And by the way, I want to mention before I go on that this dean that I'm complaining about was actually a great dean and a great person. There was just this one thing he did that we disagreed with, but I didn't want to paint an ugly picture of him. He was a great guy. So another idea here is to make sure that you provide solutions, a path toward improvement, some direction to go. A gastroenterologist with a patient does not tell them, oh, your insides are in really bad shape, I'll see you in 10 years. They're gonna give them alternatives, a path to go, perhaps a second opinion. So when you are telling a faculty member that they need to improve something, what you want to be able to do as best you can is follow that up with some solutions and some resources. So if a lot of student feedback that you've reviewed together complains about lecturing, for instance, too much lecturing, boring lectures or whatever, and you agree that this is something that they need to work on, the good chair and dean is not just going to say, go work on that, but let me give you some options here. We have, I know there's a really good workshop, there's this webinar, there's a book, our Center for Teaching, there's something out there that can help you with this. Let me give you all these options. Now, I don't think that you need to require those particular things. Like you've got to go to this conference, you've got to collaborate with this person, because what could happen is they could do that thing and then come back the next year with no change and say, well, I did what you told me to do. So what you don't want to do is prescribe the solution, but offer solutions, give them some resources for getting better, because you've already invested in this person. You want them to get better. You want them to be an important part of a valuable part of your team. So provide them solutions, but I would strongly recommend that you not prescribe specific ones. Now, when it comes to teaching, of course, one of the best places to go, if you're fortunate to have a Center for Teaching and Learning on your campus or some similar name, is to encourage them to seek out support there. Of course, some centers will help with scholarship, writing, a variety of things, and most of them are focused specifically on teaching. But again, I would suggest that you offer the CTL as a resource and not as a requirement. Don't say, I'm going to send you to the center because your teaching is in bad shape and you really need to work on it. Centers for Teaching and Learning don't want to be the principal's office. They don't want to be the place that bad teachers get sent, and they will probably fight you on that. In fact, I know we have several Center for Teaching and Learning directors registered for the webinar, whether they're here or not, but I want to ask you if we have time at the end here to provide your thoughts about how best deans and chairs can use centers when faculty are struggling, that don't make them seem like, the place that bad instructors are sent. The reason for they don't want this is that they want everyone on campus to use them. So they don't want to be seen as the place where only bad teachers get sent. They want everybody to go there. And so they do a number of things like have strong confidentiality agreements that we won't tell anybody that you've been to us. But they're there. So one of the solutions to this is to encourage them to go, and the center is going to say, I'm not going to tell your chair, your dean, anything about our work unless you want us to. Because in some cases, faculty will want the center to demonstrate to their chair that they have been going and getting consultations and going to workshops and working on their teaching. And they want the center to actually write a letter and say, yeah, this person's been working really hard over the last year. But that's totally on the faculty to ask for that. It's not an expectation. Otherwise, it's a very confidential thing. So anyway, if you're a CETL person, or if you're a dean or a chair who has experience in this area, I'd be curious what suggestions you can make about how to make that work as well as possible for people. So the final idea here is we might put it this way, remember your bedside manners, to continue with the analogy here. And that is, this experience of the annual review, remember a couple of things here. First of all, you're dealing with someone's career. So this is a pretty serious thing for many people, for most people. It may be something you do a lot of, and you might have even been doing it for years, but it is a big deal to people. So you need to take it seriously on that level. But it's also, for many people, a big deal personally, particularly people who are their sense of identity is heavily invested in their career. This review process is a reflection on them personally. And so it can be really, damaging to their self-esteem and their emotions. And we just need to take that into consideration when we're doing these things. So some ideas here. First of all, practice general hospitality, the way you welcome someone into the room, and it's a comfortable room, and you might even provide something to drink. You're not going to do this power situation where you're sitting behind the desk and they're sitting on the other side in the chair that's low to the ground. You're going to be in a much more collaborative, collegial environment. I've heard of a couple of people who like to do these reviews outside of the office somewhere, somewhere more casual, a restaurant or something. I don't know how appropriate that is to do or if that works for you, but I like the idea of it being a casual, comfortable situation rather than one that's has power dynamics going on in kind of an ineffective way. Also, thinking about the bedside manner idea here is, as much as possible, take an asset versus a deficit approach to exploring things. The image you're seeing, if you're not getting it, is glass is half full rather than half empty here. So you do have to talk about problems and issues if there are some, of course. You can't let them go. But you also want to focus on, as much as you can, the things that have gone right in the past year. This is similar to a parenting concept, if some of you may be familiar with, called catching them being good. And the idea that was written years ago was parents are always, getting on to children about things. Stop doing that, quit that. And instead to focus less on that and more on the things that you like them, the things that they're doing that you like them to do. And similar thing here is, I really appreciate all the effort you've given into the department this year and how much you've gone out on recruiting trips or whatever it is that you've done. That's all great. Make sure you, as much as possible, focus on the assets, because you're trying to encourage this person for growth, not beat them over the head in most cases. And so take an asset versus a deficit approach in talking with them. And a final idea here with good bedside manner is, in your annual review, you should really be doing more listening than you are talking. If you've done the things we've talked about before, where faculty are preparing ahead of time and you've had conversations throughout the year and you know what the policies are, then you put it on the faculty member to come to you with that evidence, with those plans for change, those things that are going on with them. And you're gonna spend most of your time hearing what that faculty member has to say. And this is also an opportunity for you to listen and provide appropriate and useful feedback to them on some of the conclusions that they've come to that might want to rethink. So it's sort of like a counseling situation where you're going to be listening more than you're talking to get the most out of it for both of you. This is also consistent, I might point out, with the idea that you don't have all the answers anyway. Just because a faculty member is struggling in the classroom or struggling with their scholarship or something, even with decades of experience, you don't necessarily know exactly what it is that they need to do differently to fix the problem. You might, but you might not because of their special circumstances. And you learn that sort of thing if you listen more than you talk. So all of this ties into your overall faculty evaluation process on your campus. So I want to make sure that you're aware of some resources from IDEA. Those of you who have registered for this webinar will get an email with a link to download our faculty evaluation policy review rubric you see here. It's a great way of thinking through your faculty evaluation process on your campus and areas that might need improvement. And it's a really good way of getting other people to do that. So if you're on a campus where you think there's a real problem or there's some significant weaknesses with your policy or your evaluation process, the rubric, if you can get a number of people on campus to go through it and rate your policy by these best practices, it gets the conversation going on your campus and can be a great first step in helping you make some changes there. So again, if you register for the webinar, you will get an email with a link on how to download that. And I also want to tell you that for the rest of July, the rest of this month, we're offering 30-minute consultations at no charge with our consultants, with anyone on your campus who is responsible for some aspect of faculty evaluation, to just sort of think through what are the issues that we're having and what our next steps might be to making things a little bit better. So you will get also in that email a link to sign up for one of these 30-minute free conversations, one-on-one, between one of our consultants and somebody on your campus. And if you do that, one of the other things that you're going to get is access to something we call the ART, our annual reflection on teaching guide. Remember, we were talking earlier about the importance of faculty self-evaluation. Well, this guide helps walk them through that process. And it's something I think you'll find pretty useful. And again, if you'll sign up for one of the 30-minute consultations, we'll make that available to you. So there we go, the annual review, making it more fun than a colonoscopy. Hopefully I've given you a few ideas here.